Look at the eye of the horse, not the horse, the eye. Inside that eye, no wider than a grain of rice, there is a building, a whole structure, reflected on a curved wet surface, painted in the year 1432, by a man working with a brush that in places was a single hair from a badger. No lens, no photograph, no magnifying glass that could do this. And every plant growing around that horse can be identified by a modern botanist by species. Every plant except a few. Those few are the reason a team of scientists spent 3 years cutting into this painting with surgical scalpels. What they finally uncovered underneath is a face, and you will see it before the end. A cathedral in Belgium has been guarding this thing through fire, theft, and a war that came within 2 days of destroying it. And the strangest figure in it is not the horse, not the plants, and not the man who painted them. To understand what was done to this painting, we have to start in Ghent, on the 15th of September, 1550. 2 men are walking into a chapel in Ghent. It is the 15th of September, 1550, and neither of them is a criminal. One is Lancelot Blondel from Bruges, painter, architect, city planner, the man who 1 year earlier built 2 triumphal arches for the Holy Roman Emperor. The other is Jan van Scorel, canon of Utrecht, trained in Venice, one of the most admired artists alive. They have been invited, they have permission, and the thing they are standing in front of is already 118 years old. Hold that image there, because what they are about to touch cannot be understood until you understand what it is. So let us go back. The object has a name, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. Oil on oak, 12 panels, painted on both sides, which gives you 24 painted surfaces that fold and unfold like a machine. Roughly 3.5 meters tall and 4.5 meters wide when opened, which in plain terms means it is about the size of a barn door and weighs more than an elephant. It was installed on the 6th of May, 1432, in the Church of St. John the Baptist in Ghent, now St. Bavo's Cathedral, where the restored panels stand today in the Chapel of the Sacrament. The man who commissioned it was Jus Veed, a merchant and a political heavyweight, and his wife Elizabeth Borlut. They wanted a chapel that would buy them a place in heaven. What they got was a status symbol so loud that on the day the altarpiece was consecrated, the son of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, was baptized in that same church. 2 events, 1 morning, 1 building. That is how far Veet had climbed. But there is a death buried in this commission, and it happens before the paint is dry. The work is begun in the mid-1420s by Hubert van Eyck, the older brother. In September 1426, Hubert dies. The panels are standing there, unfinished, in a chapel that has already been paid for, and the job falls to his younger brother Jan. Now look at what Jan does with the signature. On the lower frames of the wings, he has 4 lines of Latin inscribed. He calls his dead brother the painter greater than whom none has been found. He calls himself second in the art. Think about that for a moment. The surviving brother finishes the most ambitious painting in Northern Europe and signs it by ranking himself below a corpse, and the date is not written out. The year is hidden inside the last line in red letters that also work as Roman numerals so that you have to decode the sentence to learn when it was made. That inscription was later painted over and lost. It was found again in 1823 in Berlin by a restorer stripping back layers on the frame. So the painting is encrypting information before you even reach the paint. And the paint is where it stops being explicable. Jan van Eyck did not invent oil painting, whatever you may have heard, but he perfected it. Under everything there is a drawing in black pigment. Over that drawing he laid at least 3 semi-transparent layers, working light to dark, each one letting the layer beneath it glow through. That is why a flat oak board seems to have depth. That is why the colors behave like light rather than like mud. Now start looking closer, and the scale of the thing collapses. Fingernails, individual blemishes on skin, leg hair, the stubble on a jaw. Somewhere in this painting there is a jewel the size of a fingertip, and inside that jewel, painted as a reflection, is a window. Behind the enthroned central figures, the fabric is not painted at all in the ordinary sense. It is press brocade, a technique built from paint, tin leaf, wax, and gold leaf, layered to imitate expensive silk, and it was brand new and brutally difficult in the 15th century. Then there is Adam. He is life-size, naked, and photographic, down to the curl of his chest hair. Every other figure in the upper register looks straight ahead and keeps its distance. Adam does not. His foot comes forward over the edge and steps out of the frame, into your space, into your room. He is walking towards you. The public of 1432 had almost never seen a biblical figure rendered as bare flesh. That shock never really faded. In the late 1700s, Adam and Eve were taken down and hidden away. And in the 1800s, somebody decided the answer was to paint furs and skins over their bodies. And that is only what people did to it with a brush. Remember the promise: fire, theft, and a war. In 1640, flames tore through the cathedral itself, and the altarpiece came out alive. In 1794, French revolutionary troops pulled the central panels off the wall and shipped them to Paris as trophies. The wings ended up sold to Berlin. It took the peace treaty at the end of the First World War to force the whole machine back together in Ghent. Then, on the night of the 10th of April, 1934, someone walked out of the cathedral with an entire panel, the Just Judges, and mailed ransom notes to the bishop. Months later, a Ghent stockbroker named Arsène Guedertier collapsed at a political meeting and with his last breath told his lawyer that he alone knew where the panel was. He died without saying where. It has never been found. And in the Second World War, the Nazis seized the altarpiece and buried it in a salt mine at Altusee in the Austrian Alps, alongside thousands of looted masterpieces. In the final days of the war, crates of bombs were stacked inside that mine under orders to leave nothing behind. Local miners disarmed the charges days before the end. The greatest painting of the 15th century survived the 20th by a margin you can count on one hand, and the panel of the Just Judges that hangs in the altarpiece today is a copy, painted in 1945 by a Belgian restorer. Hold that fact. It is about to matter more than you think. The art historian Erwin Panofsky described Jan van Eyck's vision as a microscope and a telescope working at the same time. He meant it as praise. It also happens to be a technical description of a problem, because you can walk up to this painting with the eyes of a scientist and it will hold. Which brings us to the flowers. Researchers from the Flanders Heritage Agency and the Botanical Garden of Ghent University went through the panels species by species. They identified up to 75 different flowers, herbs, and trees. 48 of them with complete certainty, not decorative greenery, named species: Mediterranean cypress, date palm, fig, pomegranate. Hilde van Krombrug from the Botanical Garden said they were astounded by the level of detail. And here is where the case turns, because Van Eyck had actually seen those southern plants. In 1428 and 1429, he spent 10 months in Spain and Portugal on a diplomatic mission, and the architectural historian John Hooper Harvey showed that many of the species identified in the altarpiece were growing on the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century. Paradise, it turns out, was painted from life. So the botanists could name almost everything. Hélène Dubois, who ran the restoration, gave the reason for the exceptions, and it is the coldest sentence in this entire case. The plants nobody could identify were not plants at all. They were somebody else's paint. Somebody else's paint. On a surface where every leaf can be named, a handful of shapes were meaningless, and meaningless is a fingerprint. So the question stops being how a human painted this and becomes a much narrower one: how much of what you are looking at is not his? The answer arrived slowly, and it came from the center of the composition. Walk into the lower middle panel, and you find an altar in a meadow. On it stands a lamb. Around it, 14 angels in a circle, some carrying the instruments of the Passion, the cross, the crown of thorns, the column of the flogging, 2 of them swinging censers. From a wound in the animal's chest, blood runs into a golden chalice, and the lamb shows no pain whatsoever. Along the front of the altar runs a line from the Gospel of John: "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." Now, notice something about this creature. Every human being in this crowd is looking at the lamb. The lamb is looking at you. In a painting built out of hundreds of figures who mind their own business, the sacrificial animal breaks the fourth wall, and it does it with a stare. That was true before anyone touched it. It became far more true afterwards. On September 14, 2012, the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage began a full campaign inside a purpose-built laboratory at the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. What they found in the first phase alone rewrote the object. Close to 70% of the total surface of the altarpiece was overpaint. Not Van Eyck, somebody else working over him. And on the panel with the lamb, roughly half the surface was covered, including the entire head. Here is why nobody had caught it in 500 years. Hélène Dubois, who led the project, explained that the overpainting was done so early, following the shapes of the original so closely, using pigments so similar that they aged at the same rate, that it did not show up in the technical documentation when the altarpiece first came in for treatment. Nothing like it, she said, had ever been observed on early Netherlandish painting. The discovery was, in her words, a shock for everybody, for the restorers, for the church, for the International Committee of Experts watching over their shoulders. So, before a scalpel went anywhere near it, they read it chemically. Teams from the University of Antwerp and the National Gallery of Art in Washington used macro X-ray fluorescence together with infrared reflectance imaging spectroscopy. Published in the journal Science Advances in July 2020, the study did something extraordinary. It predicted the buried face before anyone saw it. It also identified not one hidden lamb, but 3 successive versions, plus evidence of an earlier, smaller body with a more naturalistic build. An older varnish layer was sitting between the original and the overpaint, acting as a buffer, which meant the top layer could be removed without destroying what was underneath. Then came 3 years of solvents and surgical scalpels, and halfway through that process, the panel produced the single most disturbing image of the entire operation, one almost nobody has seen. The background overpaint had been cleared, but the false head was still in place, which meant, for a period of months, the sacrificial Lamb of God had 4 ears. 2 of them Van Eyck's, 2 of them a stranger's, all 4 on the same skull. Professor Max Martens of Ghent University described that stage in exactly those words. In 2019, the last of it came away, and there it was. Large, close-set eyes, faced in fully forward, the way a human's face faces forward, not the way a sheep's do. A shortened muzzle, full pink lips, flared nostrils. Smithsonian Magazine called it, at minimum, alarmingly anthropomorphic. Dubois described it as cartoonish and said the original had a far more intense interaction with the onlooker. So now you know what was under the paint, which leaves the harder question. Who does that to a masterpiece, and why? And this is where the chapel in Ghent finally pays off. Marcus van Vernevik was a Ghent chronicler. Born in 1518, and in 1568, he published an account of what happened in that chapel. He records that the 2 masters came to Ghent and began to wash this panel, and that they kissed the work in many places. Kissed. In the local dialect of the period, that verb meant to clean, to improve, to correct. A 16th century writer describing the erasure of Van Eyck's hand as an act of love. They were not vandals, and the motives are documented. Max Martens gives 2. First, repair. In 1550, nobody restored a damaged robe 1 square centimeter at a time under a microscope. You repainted the whole robe, the way you repaint an entire wall to hide a single hole. Second, visibility. Van Eyck's oil varnish darkens fast, and in the poorly lit Vide Chapel, the altarpiece had become genuinely hard to see. They painted over it so that it could be seen at all. Konrad Jonkheere of Ghent University put the aesthetic side plainly. The work was adapted to the taste of the time, and the lamb ended up neutralized. They made it passive. They made it anatomically correct. They took the one thing in the painting that was staring back and closed its eyes for 500 years. And then, in December 2019, humanity was shown the original face, and humanity rejected it. The restored lamb went viral as a joke. Memes, mockery, comparisons to monsters. The Institute had to issue a statement to the BBC saying that the posts circulating reflected a misunderstanding of the results, and that the Van Eycks had deliberately given the Lamb of God human-like staring eyes, a common choice in the Middle Ages. Dubois was blunter still. This, she said, is Van Eyck's original sheep, painted over by someone else to make it look like a passive animal. Read that timeline again, because it closes on you. In 1550, 2 respected masters looked at a gaze that was too much and softened it out of love. In 2019, we got the original back, stared into those forward-facing eyes for about a week, and turned it into a meme. 5 centuries apart, the reaction is identical. The question this painting asks was never how could a human paint this? It is how long can a human stand being looked at by it? The restorers of 1550 lasted 118 years. We lasted 7 days. The Lamb is back on the altar now, behind glass, staring out of the center of the machine the way it did in 1432. Millions of eyes on it every year. Its eyes on every one of them. Nothing in the chapel blinks first. If you want to keep looking where everyone else stops looking, subscribe. And remember the panel that hangs there as a copy. The original is still missing. The ransom notes are still in a file in Ghent. And the man who knew took the answer to his grave. That case is next. See you in the next one.